All right, so good afternoon. Oh, just remember to remain muted so that we can limit background noise as we get started. Just muting folks. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Matt. Many of you may know me. I am the Outreach and Education Coordinator with NAMI Greater Cleveland, coordinator of our monthly webinars on special topics pertaining to mental health. One new thing to share with all of you who are joining us today is that we are now able at NAMI Greater Cleveland to provide CEUs, continuing education units, for counselors, social workers, and marriage and family therapists for at least some of our monthly webinars. If you are seeking the one CEU that this webinar is eligible for, please do know that you need to be present for the entirety of the webinar, and there will also be a CEU-specific evaluation that we will ask you to complete at the end. I'll leave that link open for about 24 hours. I'll share it in the chat when we wrap up, and I'll also share it in the follow-up email. So attend the entirety of the webinar, complete the CEU-specific evaluation. There's also a general evaluation that's separate, and in that CEU-specific evaluation, please provide your full name, your contact information, and your license number. And again, I'll say that when we wrap up by 1 o'clock after we have time for questions. But thank you all for joining us. We're very happy to have you here. Please know that NAMI Greater Cleveland is your Greater Cleveland area resource for consumer and family experiences pertaining to mental health and well-being. We're very happy to be joined by Latoya Logan from Project Lift Services, who will be providing today's presentation on the topic of understanding traumatic loss. So with that being said, I think I will hand it over to Latoya to get us started and to share her slides. Thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Give me one moment to just get our slideshow up. There are some videos in this presentation. They're short, but if there's any issues with volume, please just let me know. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily always share the way that we like them to. So please just let me know if that is the case. Okay. So, I see a hand raised. Is there?
Let me see. Yes, Tamika, did you have a question or is that an accident? Not hearing anything might be an accident.
No, I'm sorry. I accidentally hit the.
Okay. No worries. I'll lower it for you.
No problem. Okay, so we are going to be discussing today understanding traumatic loss and how social emotional learning really impacts grief recovery. This is a topic that a couple of years ago I really started to invest in. I myself am a grief recovery specialist, trained to facilitate that program, and went through it myself to address my own grief. And I think oftentimes with loss in general, we have a lot of misconceptions and ill-advised traditions that kind of harms our capacity to truly understand what loss is, to navigate what the grieving process would look like, and then to enter a new phase of recovery. So today, I'm hoping to cover that in this 60 minutes. Also, there's a lot of information on the slides. I'm okay if they are shared. And so we are going to try to cover quite a bit. So if you have questions, just let me know and I'll do my best to answer them. Our objectives are really straightforward. I want to define grief and loss for you and what might be some of those connections that we often kind of overlook, even if it is connected to trauma, but it may not always be. We're going to evaluate the components of prolonged grief disorder, which was an inclusion in the DSM-5 TR. And then we're going to review best practices for trauma and grief recovery. And again, this is an hour, so there's going to be some things we're not going to be able to go as in depth with, but I'll do my best to give you the foundational information. So I like to start with a quote from Sabah Tahar. Your emotions make you human. Even the unpleasant ones have a purpose. Don't lock them away. If you ignore them, they just get louder and angrier. Oftentimes, when I'm working with the courts, most of my clients are court involved at some level, whether it's child welfare or actual criminal court. And judges and prosecutors really like to hone in on they're angry and miss the whole underlying cause of grief, loss, traumatic loss that's kind of shaped that angry presentation. And when we focus on anger, we kind of just don't deal with anything else. And with grief work, it's important for us too. So I like to start with just talking about what is understanding loss. When we think of loss, primarily people are thinking of loss of person. And definitely that is a significant loss in life that we have to navigate. But there are many other losses that we will begin to experience from the moment we ever have anything, literally in our childhood, early childhood development, that kind of gets swept under the rug and not truly addressed. And then that kind of compounds over life. So there are transitional losses. Maybe you lost your job and that has changed things for you. And people might say, don't grieve a job, get another. But if that was a job that was important to you, then you absolutely may need to grieve that job. Graduating, while it's a positive thing to experience, it can also leave people with a lot of feelings of overwhelm. What am I going to do next? Incarceration carries the grief of going into the system and losing all your connections and certainly having those connections modified, but then also transitioning out of incarceration and trying to find your footing and how to actually navigate a new world you haven't been a part of. Pregnancy can be a transition, whether you wanted the pregnancy or not, moving and loss of addiction. And I want to spend a little time there. When we think about addiction and substance use work, we tend to say to people something that I think is kind of abnormal. We say to them, get sober and everything is going to get better. And then we kind of wave this thing around, well, you can get a job. And I don't understand that logic. A person who is entering sobriety after a period of addiction is losing a lot. They're losing their friendships. They're losing the places that were of comfort to them. They're losing the places that they felt they belonged in. They're losing their routine. So there's a lot of loss in pursuing sobriety. And the best we can offer is getting a job and paying bills, not much of a carrot. So we want to think about when we're working with people who are in transitional periods, what part of this work needs to be focused on grief? Relationships. Divorce could be a great thing. You were like, I'm so happy to get rid of that person, but I'm so sad they're not going to take the trash out anymore. Death of people, foster care, and separations. We know now that we want to keep our kids as connected as possible to their family of origin and not remove them, because research tells us that removal, even from an unsafe, unhealthy environment, does more damage to the child than placing them in an unknown environment. So we want to think about grief and loss, even if we're forced to separate families. Estrangement. So we're not talking to anyone, a person anymore. It doesn't mean that you don't miss them. And then finally, pets. Pets are have relationships with people as well, and those particular relationships are just as meaningful as any other. And so grieving the loss of an animal is important. There are impact losses. Abuse. One of the things that abuse does outside of creating self-worth issues is that it takes you and it robs you of your sense of security, of your sense of safety, and of your sense of self to govern your body and what you choose to do. Violence in a community can lead to a significant loss, not just from the person, but loss of a business, loss of the option to utilize a park space. Illnesses. Anyone who has developed an illness over time knows that the first things you start thinking about is all the things you can't do and how much more difficult it is to kind of navigate spaces as a result of that. And unfortunately, again, in our world, we tell people, well, you should just be happy you're up and moving. And they don't seem to connect in and understand, like, I am, but I'm also overwhelmed with everything I've lost in the process of this fighting for my health. And then there can be environmental factors that contribute to a feeling of loss and grief. Right now, we're dealing with some serious issues in Gaza, in Sudan, in the Congo, in Haiti, and all that is being pushed into our brains. And we want to help. And it's like, but we can only do so many things. And then you feel guilty because you're eating oysters and they don't have food. And it's just a lot to kind of carry on your back and still be able to live in some seeming like normal or joyous way. I think the intangible losses are the ones we really kind of throw to the side. And I think that they can be more impactful because they can transform the way that you trust yourself and you trust others, how you engage, what risk you would be willing to take, even if you want to live in your life. So intangible losses are losses of safety. And again, that could be because of abuses, but that could be just because of where you're living. It could be a loss of security. If your home was burglarized or your car was burglarized, now where do you go to feel that you're secure? It could be a loss of trust. I work with a lot of clients who tell me they can't trust anybody but people that they met from day one. So I'm like, from infancy? And they're like, yeah. So basically, you can't have any new people in your life. So what a limited life a person is choosing if they can't trust new people. A loss of respect for others or for yourself. There is a really great handout. There's a training going around on faith-based grief, where you feel that your faith betrayed you. You've lost a sense of faith. And I think, again, in our field, we do a lot of work on mental health and emotional health and connecting to physical health. And we forget that people are holistic and spiritual and faith-based concerns are just as important. Sometimes we can lose expectations. So again, we believe that something is going to happen for us. We would like it to happen. And then unfortunately, something occurs and we no longer can do that thing. And so now what I expected gets diminished, what I had maybe even hoped for. Dreams might get changed, what we choose to believe is possible for us, and what is normal. I have a couple of clients who are always talking about wanting to be normal. And what I really know what they mean is wanting to be accepted, to be validated, to belong somewhere, to have a sense of safety in their identity. And so these are losses that are pervasive and really impact decisions, choices, interactions, relationships. These are people who will get up and leave in a moment because they don't feel safe. And we think they're being reckless, but they're just simply trying to reestablish safety. So what is grief? I can tell you my first experience with loss was probably around 7 years old. My elder aunt had passed away, and we went to the funeral, and everybody was crying, and I had not really known her, so I didn't have tears related to her. I just knew everybody was very sad. And then everybody ate a lot. We had so much food. I just was like, well, what did we starve ourselves for a minute? Are we never going to eat again? What is happening here? Everybody was eating. And then that turned into a big party. And I was like, okay, so this is what grief is. You get really, really sad, you eat a lot, and then you party. So you have to think about what have you been taught about grief? So the American Psychological Association, the APA, says that grief is the anguish experienced after significant loss, usually the death of a beloved person. For the purposes of this training, we're saying loss is any loss, a transitional loss, an impact loss, an intangible loss, a relationship loss, any loss that has had an impact on you. Grief often includes physiological distress, separation, anxiety, confusion, yearning, and obsessive dwelling on the past and apprehension about the future. So it kind of sounds a lot like trauma. It is not trauma. It is not depression. It is a very different emotion that unfortunately kind of gets grouped together. So I'm hoping to pull those apart today. Grief may take the form of regret for something lost, remorse for something done, or it could be sorrow over something that has occurred. This is why anger is so important to evaluate. A lot of times when we're children and we don't have a frame of reference to truly understand what we're experiencing and what we're feeling, but we do know what we've seen. And all children are exposed to anger. Anger as a means of educating, anger as a means of obtaining compliance, anger as a means of getting someone to do what you want them to do or to stop doing something you don't want them to do. And so our children then, when they're experiencing loss, turn to anger as an expression. They get mad. They go snatch a toy from another kid because theirs broke. They hit something or throw something or stump around. This isn't just toddler behavior. This is indicative of the development of that person's emotion and not knowing what is happening inside to explain it or at least to help them frame it. Acute grief occurs in the early period after loss and usually is when we're seeing people more tearful, more overwhelmed with strong emotions. This is where the lot of the malaise kind of comes in, sleeping a lot or staying active. If you're a member of my family, you don't sit down until after the person is in the ground. You got to keep moving. And so acute grief is when we are hit the hardest with the initial pain. In this state, we're going to feel everything: anxiety, guilt. Guilt is a big one. What could I have done? What should I have done? Shame if you didn't make amends, or if you had a not so happy conversation prior to the last time you saw the person. And so we try to do things that would help us deal with the loss. And this would include substance use as well. Currently, we believe there's about 7 to 10% of adults who have experienced persistent symptoms of prolonged grief disorder. So if you think about the population in America, we're talking about 338 million people, and over half of those being adults. So we're talking roughly 15 million people are walking around with the symptoms of prolonged grief disorder, and they don't know it because far too many clinicians don't know what prolonged grief disorder is. They've never diagnosed it. They don't know how to separate the symptoms out from trauma or from depression. And so instead of providing a grief-focused therapeutic session, it becomes a trauma-focused or depression-focused. Integrated grief is where we want to get people to. This is where they are starting to understand and process, okay, loss has occurred. I'm no longer overwhelmed to walk into that room where they used to sit. I can hear their voice on an old recording and not be taken back to that moment of acute loss at that time. When they're engaging in integrated grief, this is where a person is doing more celebration of life as opposed to being stuck in the significant emotions of the loss. So you might be doing things like, well, it's their birthday coming up. And so what did they used to like? They loved whatever. And you have that for them. Or something that they used to watch comes on. And instead of turning it off because you can't bear to watch it without them, you sit and watch it and recall positive experiences with that person. This does not mean that the person is completely adapted to their loss, but it does mean that they're starting to move towards a phase of recovery. What we know about children is that about 5 to 10% will experience depression, PTSD, and or prolonged grief disorder following a loss. And part of the reason this number is as high as it is, and we see this kind of pattern happen, is because, again, children don't know what to do with loss. Remember, they don't have abstract thinking. And they've never been in a situation where they can say, oh, well, you lose something, and then this is the way that we kind of grieve through that process. So when loss occurs with children, they kind of internalize it and shut down. With prolonged grief disorder, and this criteria is very difficult, and I know there is talks right now with the updating of the DSM-5 that they kind of pull this out because there are some significant limitations with diagnosing this disorder. The first is, oh, there's a question, Jacqueline? Or maybe not.
There was one question that we can address probably at the end. Just was curious about your grief recovery certification.
Oh, okay, will do. So with prolonged grief disorder, it has a very stringent timeline, and I am anti-disorders that require you to meet a timeline of experiencing certain emotions, because if you know, and all of you do as providers, people are not writing down the first day they experience grief and counting the days and documenting the symptoms. Usually by the time they get to us, it is because they have tried everything else they know to do and they've not been able to reach a resolution. So this particular disorder is saying that in order to be diagnosed with this, the loss must have occurred at least 1 year ago for adults and at least 6 months ago for children and adolescents. Again, I'm not a fan of that, and I encourage you as a provider to use your clinical impression. If someone's primary concern is grief and they're exhibiting the criteria I'm going to go over, then this is the appropriate diagnosis that they should receive. It also says that they must have experienced at least 3 of the symptoms nearly every day for the last month. Now, if you've been in a car accident, your attorney told you to keep a journal of all your pain, and you do for the first couple of days, maybe weeks, because you're like, yes, I'm in a lot of pain. But as you start to kind of it goes up and it goes down and life happens, that doesn't occur. So again, we want to rely on our clinical impression to identify what is the primary concern. The PGD symptom criteria, as I said, kind of mirrors PTSD, but it is not PTSD. The first thing it says is that they must have an identity disruption. And they characterize that as feeling as though a part of themselves has passed away or is gone, is to never be recovered. Now, we hear this as a common statement, particularly spouses or loss of a child. But this is also true when someone loses a career, when someone enters retirement, when someone experiences a chronic illness. Who they are has been forever transformed. And so I want you to think a little bit broader in terms of them saying a part of me has died. They may say, I have lost something that I will never get back. Okay. I'm just checking the chat to make sure I'm not missing questions. All right. They may exhibit a marked sense of disbelief about the death or the loss, so unable to imagine how it could have happened. Avoidance of reminders that the person is dead or the thing is gone. Intense emotional pain related to the death. And it says anger, bitterness, and sorrow. But I want you to also think about hostility, suicidal ideation. And it may not be that they say, I want to die. It could be, I just want to end the pain. So that is also a statement to pay attention to. Difficulty with reintegration. So they're going to work, but maybe they're making a lot of mistakes that they never would make before. They're taking care of the kids, but not to the level they used to. They're talking to you and showing up, but you notice there is a kind of void in their interactions. Emotional numbness, aka apathy. And if you've ever been in a training with me before, you know apathy is one of my favorite emotions because it gets a really bad rap. People say to be apathetic, you're a sociopath or you're antisocial. No, that's not true. Everyone experiences apathy. It is a defense mechanism. It is one of the first that pops up because if we can numb ourselves, then we can distance ourselves from acute pain. The problem is that when we rely on apathy for prolonged periods of time, we then stop experiencing positive and negative emotions. So it works a little too good in creating detachment. So we want to ask not just, are they feeling pain, but are they able to experience joy? Have they laughed at anything recently? Feeling that life is meaningless. I have no purpose. So my grandmother is 96 years old. And a couple years ago, when she turned 90, she was talking to my cousin and I, and she made this statement. She's 90 something years old at this point, and she's no longer able to cook, and her hands are hurting. And she says to us, I feel so unnecessary. And my cousin bursts out in tears. Oh, and I'm listening because I'm like, whoa, that's a red flag. She didn't say she's suicidal. She didn't say life is meaningless. She said she feels unnecessary. And when we asked her why, she said, I can't cook for you all anymore because her arthritis is so bad and she can't stand at the stove. And she can't do her hair anymore because she's not able to hold the comb. So it's this loss of who she was as the matriarch of our family and believing that that's where her value is. So one of the first things we would want to think about is what can we do to shift her understanding of her value? And then the last thing, intense loneliness, feeling alone or detached from others. And this can again result from aging. The older you get, the more you will lose. You're going to lose people, you're going to lose places, you're going to lose familiarity. And that's a very painful process to go through because nobody holds your story anymore. If you're the oldest person in your family, there's nobody to say, I remember when you were. And while we think that that isn't meaningful, man, does that create a sense of belonging. So I don't want you to just focus on loss as a person. I want you to really think about intangible losses, losses of stories, losses of expectations, losses of experience. Increased risk factors for prolonged grief disorder are our older adults. And research tells us the older you get, you should be around younger people, children even, because they keep you vibrant, they keep your brain sharp, they keep you moving, they introduce new ideas to you. I mean, one thing about a 3-year-old talking to a 96-year-old, I mean, they're like talking to this person like they know who all the animated characters are, and they're zealous about it, and so that makes the person zealous as well. People with a history of depression or bipolar disorder, because there's already a level of mood instability or at least inconsistency that would unfortunately escalate these experiences. Caregivers. Now, NAMI had me do a training on caregivers last year. And I love training on it because caregivers are stuck in a really complicated situation. Caregivers are called martyrs and saviors and saints because they are taking care of a person. And then they hear that and they can't express how they feel. They can't say, I'm overwhelmed. I am waiting for this to stop. I don't know what to do. I don't think I can handle it one more day. Because if they say that, then people will say, you should be thankful that you're able to take care of your mother or your spouse. And so there's this isolation that happens, able to fully live out their stories. And then finally, sudden or traumatic circumstances. This could be a car crash. This could be a house fire. This could be anything that you couldn't anticipate occurring, which in life is almost everything. Prolonged grief disorder often occurs along with other mental health disorders. So PTSD is one of those diagnoses that we know. You can be diagnosed with PTSD and you can also be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. You can be diagnosed with PGD and also be diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, or depression. I know they like us to just say it's one thing, but I have yet to meet a client who has just one thing happening. Usually it's layers of things, and we do our best to prioritize what the symptoms that are causing the most impairment. So we have to talk about trauma because, again, trauma and grief kind of become interchangeable. And again, because they share so many of the same symptoms or expressions. But it's important to understand that trauma and grief are not the same because loss is going to happen every day no matter what. You're going to lose your favorite toy. You're going to lose a relationship. You're going to lose a job. These might be things you wanted to happen, but it's still a form of loss. Trauma is different because trauma is in response to something that was, for the most part, intended to be negative. A car accident, sexual abuse, racism, any of those things that we know have the capacity to negate a person's sense of worth or identity is related to trauma. Trauma is also a normal response to experiencing such emotional issues. Trauma occurs when our ability to cope is overwhelmed. Judith Herman says that it's a distressing experience and it's totally subjective. Loss is the opposite. Loss occurs whether we are able to cope with it or not. We're losing every single day. Most of us are not experiencing trauma every single day. Trauma responses include shame, guilt, inferiority, anger, physically acting out, promiscuity, particularly in our teens, and people who are impoverished. We don't think about promiscuity in connection to poverty and feeling less than. But one thing is always true. Well, wait, let me change that. One thing is often true is sex is free and it's accessible to people no matter where you may be. And so this is a way of seeking pleasure when you're experiencing a lot of distress. So I want you to think about that. Again, Cuyahoga County is a top 50 county for HIV cases, and Cuyahoga County has a lot of poverty. So it makes sense that, we're not seeking services, we're not getting tested, we're not doing certain things because I'm overwhelmed. Substance abuse, poor peer association, low self-esteem, isolation, emotional numbing, aka apathy, desensitization, and self-injurious behavior. And self-injurious behavior can be a whole host of things. Yes, we know about cutting and we know about hair pulling, but it can be punching the walls. It could be intentionally getting into a fight with someone so that you can experience a release through that activity. It could be overeating to the point of where you are vomiting. It could be intentionally getting in your car when you know you are intoxicated and saying, well, whatever happens, happens. So some things look like substance abuse that actually are suicidal ideation or self-injurious behavior. Post-traumatic stress is when there is a presence of the whole host of these particular criteria. Now, I am not a fan of the PTSD criteria. SAMHSA introduced partial PTSD in 2015 and has been lobbying the APA organizations to include it because not everybody is going to have all the symptoms of PTSD. From my understanding, hopefully in our next update, we will actually have a trauma NOS diagnosis for people who don't meet the criteria of PTSD, but where trauma is their primary area of social impairment. So the symptoms connected to PTSD are persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic events. This could be anything. It could be a smell. It could be a building. It could be police. It could be a tone of voice. I have had clients walk in. I change my hair all the time, and I had red hair this particular time. And this client came in and said, "I can't work with you. You look like my mother." And I said, "Okay." I get that. That makes total sense. Let me refer you to somebody else. So it could be anything that's external. It includes negative alterations in cognition. So basically, you have a cognitive bias. All people of a certain type are dangerous. These communities are unsafe. You can't trust people. The world is unfair and is set up to hurt you. It could also include marked alterations in arousal, so not being able to truly self-stimulate or to be stimulated even in activities. And we often see when this happens an increase of engaging in adrenaline-seeking behavior. So doing things that will cause a rush because they're not able to self-stimulate. Usually we see the presence of this for more than a month, but again, I don't pay attention to the times because often people come to us when they are in crisis. So that shouldn't be something that gets them a mark that it's not PTSD. And we should see some level of significant distress, whether in their social functioning, how they're dealing with their friends, whether in their occupation, are they switching jobs often or being written up often, and even in other areas. Maybe they're not able to pay their bills, maybe they're sleeping all day long, maybe they're drinking more. It could be anything. Traumatic loss involves the loss of a person or a thing in a traumatizing way. Now I know that is a weird definition, but I have to give it to you because that's how they define it. So then what would be a traumatic loss? I believe it's for the person to name. I can say all day long, you know, this person is older and we expected them to pass away. And so that's not traumatic to me. And that can't, so it shouldn't be traumatic to you. That is an unfair judgment that diminishes that person's experience and basically will set them up for failure in the therapeutic process. But for the APA, they identify a few things: homicide, suicide, accidents, natural disasters, and losses that can result from war or terror. A traumatic loss, in my opinion, is anything that makes you feel as though you and your body and in your mind are no longer valid. That somehow something is wrong with you, that somehow something was wrong with the person that you lost. It has changed the way you think. Traumatic bereavement is when the natural grieving process gets disrupted. So we're going to look at the natural grieving process in a moment. And this could be disrupted as a result of continually being or experiencing trauma or continually experiencing loss. I have a client who's literally 22 years old, and in a matter of 18 months, he lost 5 people, 3 in very traumatic circumstances. So he's never been able to truly engage in any grieving process because it's just been significant loss after significant loss. So traumatic bereavement is kind of when it compounds and it leaves a lasting impact on your well-being and your functioning. You could have crying spells. You could have cursing out spells. Some of you have those even though you're not and undergoing traumatic bereavement. You could be short-sighted or short with people or rude to people. It could be any of those things. So this chart comes from the CDC and they say PTSD and traumatic bereavement kind of cross. They're not always going to go all the way, but when it comes to childhood traumatic grief, we see more cases of PTSD in connection. And part of that, again, is because they don't have a frame of reference to navigate the experiences they're having. We also see in traumatic bereavement, for those of you who are working with our kids, conduct disorder. So if you're diagnosing a youth with conduct disorder, you probably need to assess them for traumatic bereavement for grief and loss, because my guess is they've lost something. Depression, low mood, and anxiety disorders are all connected as well. So how do we begin the process of healing and recovery? I'm going to play this video. It's very short. Hopefully you can hear it well enough. I'm going to turn it all the way up.
Inflation hurts families, and Senator Sherrod Brown is doing something about it. He wrote a bill to crack down on companies sneaking less product into the package and charging more. Tell Sherrod Brown, keep fighting to protect Ohio.
When we're grieving a profound loss, we often say we're heartbroken, but it might be more accurate to call it brain broken, given the role the brain plays in grief. As your brain adjusts to the loss of someone you love, you might feel numb, depressed, or foggy. But moving through the stages of grief is natural and healthy. It helps you process your loss and begin to move forward over time. This is Your Brain On, where we explore how the world affects our brains and ourselves. The experience of grief is twofold: the immediate acute pain of the loss and the months afterward as you mourn. The loss of someone meaningful functions as a stressor, triggering the pituitary gland at the base of the brain to produce adrenocorticotrophin, or ACTH. ACTH sends a signal to the adrenal gland to release cortisone, a stress hormone. Unlike, say, a temporary threat, grief is an intense, persistent stressor, so your body remains flooded with cortisone. That can cause your immune system to falter, making you feel run down. This is likely why some bereaved spouses fall ill soon after their partner dies. Even if the death of your loved one was expected, the actual event can still feel like a shock to the system. In the short term, a traumatized brain is bottom-heavy, meaning primitive areas, including the fear center, are overactive, adding to feelings of stress and despair. Meanwhile, higher cortical areas of the brain are underactive, like the anterior cingulate cortex, which helps regulate emotion. You may find it difficult to let go of minor annoyances or experience symptoms like increased heart rate for several minutes after you're startled. However, over time, the initial shock of the loss typically gives way to a deep sadness or depression as you continue to mourn. Depression can cause widespread changes across several parts of the brain, including the amygdala, which regulates sleep behavior and mood, and the hippocampus, which processes memory and regulates stress hormones. These changes disrupt core functions of our bodies and minds. As you grieve, you may find yourself sleeping too little or too much, forgetting things, or trapped in a brain fog. These feelings are difficult, but the acute pain doesn't last forever. Eventually, the sadness begins to lift at least a little bit, and then you may move on to feelings of anger or guilt before slowly moving toward acceptance of the loss. Experts agree the bereaved follow their own individual timelines, but in general, this three-stage process usually takes about a year. There are steps you can take to feel better as you go through the grieving process. Talk therapy can be a major help. This might be group bereavement meetings or cognitive behavioral therapy, which can redirect negative thoughts. Aerobic exercise can improve mood, memory, and thought processing. Talking with friends about the person you lost can be a great comfort too. Studies show long-term grief actually activates neurons in the reward centers of the brain. And recalling the time spent with those who have died reminds us that the memories still live on.
So I love that video because I think it helps to clarify a couple of things. When we're grieving, it isn't just happening like emotionally. It's happening in our body and it's happening in our brain. Our brain is being impacted by chemicals that are being released because they don't know what to do with the loss. It's like a person who's had a limb amputated. They will still say, wow, there's pain there. It's itching. I need to touch it, even though it's not there because the brain hasn't caught up to that there's a change in the body, so it continues to seek and pull on it. And that's the same with every loss that we have. It's like a kid who loses their favorite toy, and you go get them another one, and they throw that one on the ground, and they're like, no, I need the one that is filthy. That's the one that's going to make me the happiest. And so, we kind of get like, what is going on here? But that's what's going on, is that there's an imprint, a neural pathway that is connected to whatever that was. And the brain is going to continue to seek it out until there is some sense that learning has occurred and that loss is okay. And this is why we say grieving is a part of learning. We must teach people to understand that loss is a part of life, and that we are to process through it, we are to understand it, and we can recover from it. When the brain is having difficulty looking and pulling on things, it continues to replay back memories. So you'll see that clients will get stuck and they'll keep telling you the same story over and over and over again. They're not being elusive. They really are reliving the memories of that person or that loss or that thing. And so we want to give them an opportunity to kind of process through that. Now, in trauma, we follow a triphasic model, and this comes from Judith Herman as well, who wrote Trauma and Recovery. I would encourage you to read it if you're interested in really doing a deep dive in trauma work. And she says, in order for us to recover, we have to have safety and stabilization, trauma memory and processing, and most importantly, reconnection. So safety and stabilization is where we address cognitive distortions. This person left me, so I am no good. I'll never have a relationship again. I lost this job, so that means I'm a failure. I'll never try anything again. Everything just falls apart. We want to create a sense of safety, or I should say, mentally, emotionally, physically, and environmentally. This is critical because sometimes as providers, we talk about safety and we're only talking about physical safety. We're not highlighting the necessity of having emotional safety. Can I express myself without consequence? Or having environmental safety? Can I walk somewhere and feel safe in my space, in my body, and in my thoughts? We want to teach self-soothing techniques in this process. So this could be breathing techniques. This could be journaling. This could be utilizing rocking, styming to support them. And our goal is to move them from danger to internal safety. So they may feel safe in our office, but we want them to feel safe wherever they go, to take that as an internal coping strategy long-term. Trauma memory and processing, you need to be licensed to do this work. This is deeper work into really addressing difficult memories. In any loss, there are positives and there are negatives. My mom, well, both my parents passed away. My mother passed away when I was 15 years old, and I was her caregiver. And that led me to memorialize my mother. She was the best mother ever. And I went to therapy years later to deal with just life. And my therapist said, I think the most important thing to me, she says, two things can be true about your mom. She was great and she didn't meet all your needs. How do you feel about that? And I was like, holy crap, I can have two thoughts about this and I'm not taking away from the memory and the love. And that's, again, something that we struggle with, is we think we have to be all positive or all negative when there's this huge gray area when we're trying to process memories associated with our trauma. We want to help them to understand the traumatic event and the resulting impact, not just they went to jail if that's what happened, or they lost a relationship if that's what happened, but how did it impact their belief about the world? How did it impact their belief about themselves? How did it impact their belief about people? Because anytime we experience trauma, we create an I am statement, a people are statement, and a world is statement. So you want to make sure we're addressing those. We want to highlight and try to help them to become desensitized to those trauma memories or triggers. So exposure therapy is an option there, where we create discomfort in a safe space and then help them to process through that so that they can recover without crisis. Reconnection is one of the most important things we can do. When we experience any form of loss and we don't have meaningful connections where we belong somewhere, where we know, and some of you on this have heard this before, you know who you are and you know whose you are. So many people are walking around and they don't know whose they are. They don't have forever families because they've aged out of foster care. They've come out of incarceration and they don't have any relationships or support. Maybe they just had a small family to begin with and they weren't close. And so helping people to create an identity that is aligned with their values so they can safely create intimate relationships where there's vulnerability, where there's trust, and most importantly, where there's a sharing of who they are. When we're working on reconnection, the first thing we do is help them to own their own identity. They get to say who they are. And again, this goes back to trauma processing and narrative therapy. You write the story, and then you write the future of your story as you want to see yourself. The second thing we do is help them to separate themselves from trauma. We have to stop allowing our clients to say, well, trauma is why I'm here. I got here because I got through it. No, trauma destroys. You got here because before trauma ever happened, you had some resiliency there. You had characteristics that you're now pulling on, strengths that you're now pulling on to help you move through the trauma. Self-trust. So if you've read the book, The Four Agreements, then you know one of the things he says is that if you don't trust other people, it's because you don't trust yourself. So we need to help them to understand, where did they begin to experience that break in trust of themselves so that they can begin to repair and trust others. We want to focus on the present and the future. Now, I know when you are doing trauma processing work of the memories, you have to live in the past. But when we move to the phase of reconnection, when we're trying to get them to trust the external world, we have to move from the past, because the past is only life's evidence that it can't work. We have to look at the present and the future and create a new story on why it can work. Forgiveness. I don't think I work with any client where we don't talk about forgiveness. And I often encourage my clients to write a letter of forgiveness. And it never fails. Most of my clients write a letter to themselves. It is a very powerful tool for them to acknowledge. And in grief recovery method work, one of the things they ask you to do when you've lost someone or you're dealing with a form of loss, the person could still be here, is you identify significant emotions and events connected to that person. You identify things that you need to apologize to them for, because we're not all doing the right thing all the time. And then finally, you forgive them. And so you can do that for yourself. What are the significant things that happen in my life that I'm proud of? What are the things I need to apologize to myself for allowing to happen? And what are the things I need to forgive myself because I didn't know, or I just didn't make the best decision to protect myself? And then that's the last form of reconnection. Belief that you can protect yourself. Again, when you've experienced traumatic bereavement, the first things that go is a sense of safety, a sense of security, and a sense of stability. So if we can help them begin to reestablish those components in their life that are self-directed and aligns with what they believe is the intention of their life, the recovery is going to be more effective. I love this graph because this is the difference between being stuck in our grief and beginning to recover from that trauma. When we're stuck in our grief, what happens is that we just stay limited. We stay in this small confinement. When we choose to believe that our world can grow, that we can grow, then we don't have to focus so much on the grief. We can focus on adding things around us that helps us to remember that we are all connected and that there is purpose outside of the grief. We don't just have to hone in on it. 3 primary dimensions of the multidimensional grief theory is: number 1, separation distress. You can't begin to resolve traumatic grief or loss if you don't deal with the separation distress. How do they feel alone? Do they feel lonely? And I don't just mean physically, but do they feel lonely emotionally? That there's no one who will understand them? Do they feel alone mentally? That people just misunderstand their perspective? Because sometimes they are around people, but they're not included or engage with people. We want to look at identity or existential distress. I can't move past this moment. People who have been fired from a job really have a hit to their confidence. Well, I got fired, so I don't think I can. And they start to apply for jobs that are below their skill level because they're like, well, I lost that job. So sometimes that existential or identity distress is really about a feeling. We want to look at circumstance related distress as well. If they were married or maybe in a long-term relationship and someone passed away, their partner passed away, were they forced to leave the house because they didn't have any ownership of the home? That's a circumstance-related distress that definitely kids who are placed into foster care. And as a former foster care kid and an adopted child, I can tell you, foster care parents don't get it. Yes, you're doing a great job, but that doesn't mean I don't miss where I came from or I don't miss those individuals. So again, always thinking of how loss can show up. And so we want to think about different grief reactions, how to manage loss reminders and cope with angry feelings, but then also too, for us to use mementos for positive reminiscing about the loss. Creating a therapeutic arc is using that triphasic model. So beginning first with self-soothing techniques that allows the person to calm and become emotionally regulated so that they can reduce the distress, and then transitioning to introducing external supports, which could be people, places, or things. It depends on the person. Recovery methods that you can use means that we're focusing on small positive changes, which just can take a long time. I know in the video, they said it can resolve within a year, and that's true. Traumatic grief can resolve within a year if you don't experience another loss and another trauma. But if you are living life and you continue to experience roadblocks and setbacks, then it can take a lot longer. So we want to focus more on this being an ongoing process, and that we are focusing on including positive actions of self-care, not just taking a bath, but going to the doctor, going to the dentist, speaking with people, engaging in appropriate support, which could be grief. They may not be ready for therapy just yet. And then asking them, what systems do we have in place that are already available to them? I'm going to skip these two exercises. These are actual interventions you can utilize. So if you get the slides, you can utilize these two interventions. But I want to go over this video, and I think I might have to, yeah, we have enough time for it.
Here at Southwest General, we
It's
care
not
for
this.
you just as we would and do care for our own families.
More heinous crimes committed in Ohio by illegal immigrants. The driver of the minivan that hit a school bus full of kids in Clark County.
As you watch the video, I just want you to consider the criteria of prolonged grief disorder and then think about what symptoms she's experiencing.
Hello, I'm Bethany. And I've come to see you today because for the last 6 months, I've been finding it very difficult to cope. I've lost my husband, and I was suffering before and I was managing. But since his death, I'm finding it very unbearable. And, I just need to speak to somebody because I'm finding it really hard to cope. I don't know if you can help me at all. Is there anywhere that you could advise me to go and seek help? Because I feel like I'm at a loss at the moment. And I just don't have the energy to get up in the morning. I don't want to cook. I don't want to see friends. My children, they're all grown up and they don't live in the country anymore. And I feel as if I've lost all my family, and I'm just really, really lonely. And I really miss my husband very, very much. He was my soulmate. And no, without him, I don't really know how I'm going to see the rest of my years through. And, I'm just finding it tough. I don't know. The medication I'm on as well, Cipramil. Taking it daily, but sometimes I just don't want to take it because I feel as if it's not helping me as much as before. I don't know if it's because I feel as if I've got a lot of stress and pressure on, with the death of my husband. So I'm looking to change the medication. I don't know what you would think of that. If there is anything else that would help me. You know,
I'm gonna end it there because I want to talk about a couple things. She just talks about her children not being there anymore. So what type of loss was she experiencing? And you can unmute yourselves and answer if you don't mind, or if you want to, I should say. Okay, not a talking bunch. Gotcha. So she lost her husband, but that's not the loss. That's not sufficient enough to characterize her loss. She lost her soulmate. She made a point of saying that. And then the statement following that is, I don't know how to do life without him. Because that's who her expectation was. We're going to grow old, because she's not an old woman. We're going to grow old and we're going to do these things. My grown kids are gone. So that would be fantastic. We're going to do all these things. And then he passes away. She tells us that she was a caregiver and that her children no longer live in the country. So she's experiencing a loss of relationship and support as well. She goes on to talk about not being able to get out of bed and not doing anything. So she's not working. She's not engaged in any extracurricular activities that would keep her connected into the world. And so she's living a very isolated life, which is increasing her symptoms of PGD. And she's also taking medications for depression. Now, I do want to make sure that we're clear about this. There is no medication to resolve grief. I mean, there's really no medication to resolve any mental health symptoms, not completely. We may dull them, we may reduce them, but the goal is really to get them processing the emotions and the loss, not to add more medication. And that's what clients will do. They're taking medication. It's not working. It's not working. Well, because you're taking the meds, but you're not doing the work of processing the emotions, reestablishing safety, all those other things. When she consistently uses the term managing, I would encourage you to think about cultural language. She's saying she's managing. Hopefully no one who watched that video thinks she's managing. She's not managing anything. She's existing. She's there because she's at a crisis point, because she's saying, I'm not going to take my life, but I don't think I can go on. So we miss suicidality because we're kind of like, she's grief, she's depressed, she's looking for medication. She's looking for an answer to end pain. What are her immediate needs? She's got to stop being alone. She will not resolve her grief if she stays isolated. One of my favorite volunteer jobs in Cleveland is at the Cleveland Clinic. Not that I'm endorsing Cleveland Clinic, but they have a job for people who go in and they just hold the babies. You got to be there at 4 o'clock in the morning and you hold the babies and you feed the babies. Wouldn't that be a great thing for her to do? She'd get up early. She'd get herself together. She knows she has purpose to go do something. And it would help her to then reestablish her identity, to find purpose in her life, and to begin to think about, well, what's the next chapter of her life going to look like? So I know quite a bit in about 58 minutes. And I know I went through quickly, but we have about 2 minutes for questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions you may have.
There were a couple questions while you were speaking, LaToya, so maybe we can address those just briefly. One was if you could talk a little more about the grief recovery specialist certification that you have. Someone was curious about that, maybe looking to get trained themselves.
Absolutely. So grief recovery method is an evidence-based and validated grief psychoeducation program. And it has like a 98% efficacy rate. And as a person who's trained in it, and actually, because to get certified, you have to go through the program. Because they have a rule, you can't do something that you don't utilize. It is expensive. I can't lie to you there. It's about a little over $3,000 to get certified. But there's an entire network that provides support for you, that does training for you. So I would just look up grief recovery method. It's going to take you to a website to give you more information if you're interested in getting certified. And you can also email me and I'd be happy to answer specific questions. Oh, thank you, Robin. Any other questions? I didn't see any other in the chat.
Oh, my name's Kathleen. I just wanted to make a statement about the apathy, because let's see, I had loss at 2016, 18, 20, and 24. 20 was my mom, and people would even, I'm thanking you for explaining it, because I thought, what is wrong with me? Because I just was so strong. I just held myself together and didn't have those emotions. And you said it was more of a mechanism to
basically
just,
detach from acute pain.
yes.
Yes.
But then in 24, my brother died, and, just crying, so finally there was a breakthrough. But I just really thank you for explaining that, because people would say, why don't you cry? And I couldn't even, I didn't know what to say, because I couldn't. It was so deep.
Yep.
But I thank you so much for
Thank you
explaining
for
that.
sharing. Yeah. Absolutely. And I do see one question. This does include child abuse. Remember, we talked about impact losses. So impact losses can be abuse, it can be violence, it can even be neglect, anything that creates loss. And that's why I know the APA definition focuses on death, but loss is loss. And we want to make sure we're bringing that in, because that can result in prolonged grief disorder. I'm trying to see if there's any other questions. Again, if there are questions that you have, you can always email me, and I'll do my best to send you the information, because I know we cover quite a bit.
Remind everyone, Sam putting the links in the chat to the evaluation. So when it's the general, if you're just attending this for general knowledge, there's a survey for that. If you are attending this for CEUs, that link is in there also. I will keep the link to the CEU survey open for about 24 hours. So just doing it as soon as you can. I'll send it in the follow-up email, which will contain the slides. And this is recorded and will be posted to the NAMI GC YouTube channel later this week. And I know some folks were asking about CE certificates of completion for CE broker. I believe that will be sent to you through CASE, which is who is processing the CEUs on behalf of NAMI Greater Cleveland. But I will check on that, and I'll put my email address in the chat. You can always reach out to me about that. This is our first time offering CEUs, so just bear with me as we acclimate to that process. But just seeing a lot of gratitude for you, LaToya, in the comments here, that it was the best grief trainings anyone has ever attended. I did see one more question. What is the title of the book you mentioned earlier? What was that? Trauma and Recovery by
Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. And I did see one question about whether to say loss or lost as opposed to death or died. I think it depends on the client. I have some clients who don't want to utter the word death or died. They're okay with, I've lost someone, they've passed on. So you just, again, really working with the client to use the expressive language.
Thanks for being here. Thank you, LaToya,
Thank
for
you.
doing this for us, and hope everyone has a great day.